Finding the best deck can be mighty tough. Decision fatigue can leave you with magic paralysis, but the Rebellion possesses the right stuff. Creators and facilitators helping you soak up meta analysis.
We got Lords for your hordes. Comment below as we walk through Week 3 of Foundation Standard. Well, folks, this week we looked at 12 major tournaments encompassing 96 top 8 slots. Of those, Dimir Aggro rose to the top, sporting 16 top 8s and 4 trophies. That's right, 33% of all major tournaments this past week were won by Dimir, and 1/6 of all top 8 slots went to Kaido and friends.
My goodness. In second place, Mono Red Aggro continues to impress, notching 9 top 8s and 2 trophies of its own. There isn't a magic formula for this list. It just keeps going on knocking anyone out who stumbles or doesn't prepare.
Golgari Demons landed in third with 14 top 8s and a single trophy of its own. And as predicted, Llanowar Elves and Scavenging Ooze have given this deck the boost it needed to separate from the rest of the mid-range pack.
That's interesting. Rounding out Tier 1 is Gruul Slickshot with 12 top 8s, though not a single trophy. This list continues to put up results, but the lack of hardware at the end of the road is troubling to say the least.
Kicking off Tier 2, we have Mono White Control with 9 top 8s and 0 trophies once more. Mono White continues to feel ahead against most of the top decks in the meta, but good luck when you play off-meta combo decks. It's going to be interesting to see if this archetype can find a path through the other Tier 2 decks in the future.
Speaking of, Temur Combo, aka Talented Otters, was 6th on our list with 5 top 8s and a single trophy of its own. Now, I'm not entirely convinced this deck belongs in Tier 2, but we do dad-driven results only, and this is where it landed for Week 3.
In 7th place, we have Jeskai Convoke with 4 top 8s and a single trophy. This archetype has risen and fallen more times in the past year than I can remember, Max, but despite Pyroclasm, despite Authority of the Councils existing in Standard, it just keeps running through the occasional tournament when people aren't ready.
And finally, in 8th place, and at the end of the Tier 2 list, we have Simic Spells, aka Simic Terror, with 3 top 8s and a single trophy. Simic continues to test how much grave hate is in the format, while it plays a weird bounce tempo game, but time will tell if it can reach new heights or fade back into obscurity.
Over in Brewer's Corner, I'll walk you through the revamps of both Azorius Cookies and Sakdos.
And I'll cover Dimir Cauldron and a hot new Selesnya Aggro brew. Now, let's kick things off with the Tier 1 archetype breakdowns, starting with Dimir Aggro.
Apologies if I butcher the name. Nakata Tsuyoshi took down the 49-player Champions Cup qualifier in Namba, Japan this past Sunday with Dimir Aggro, marking an aggressive uptick in this archetype's dominance, and let's take a look at why, everyone. So, first and foremost, you're going to see Azure Beastbinder. It's back, right? I think the point of this card, more or less, is that you get to cut down everything, you get to negate their strongest threat in perpetuity while it's around, and you get to swing with impunity to draw from Enduring or force a quick Kaido. I think that's a really important aspect of this, is that we are really leaning on Kaidos and Endurings to carry the load, and this does a great job of playing into both of those. I'll also have you note there's 4 Spyglass Siren and 0 Spectral Sailor. End of the day, I think we want the ability to pump the odd Mastermind or Flood Pit Drowner with that token, or just find the lands we need and keep things moving. Also, Soulstone versus Fountain Port. I'm not sure which one's going to end up being correct, but with Demons not being a focal point, I think we look at Fountain Port and we say, okay, this might be where it needs to be right now.
Agreed. My question for you, is there really room for a third Kaido? I see one in the sideboard. If so, what matchup do you bring him in against?
So I'm not even sure if it's necessarily just matchups, right? Like, yeah, there are matchups where you want him. You definitely do if you're going up against like Mono White, if you're going up against any kind of control, ramp, any mid-range, Kaido starts to really shine because it's awkward and clunky to deal with, and it gets through. However, there are also many scenarios where you look at matchups and you go, am I on the play or am I on the draw? And if you're on the play, Kaido starts to look far more enticing versus on the draw where you're trying to volley the serve back. So the beauty of Kaido is if you're ahead, it snowballs you. But if you're behind, it's pretty rough. So I think that's really where the answer lies is, yeah, there are some obvious matchups where you want Planeswalkers because you're diversifying your threat base. But there are also many matchups where Kaido comes in or out depending on whether you're on the play or the draw post board.
Okay, that makes a ton of sense. Yeah, that'll be relevant later on when we talk about another deck as well in the Temur Otters. But first, let's talk about the next Tier 1 archetype, Mono Red Aggro.
Yokoyama Shota took down a 72-player Champion Cup qualifier in Harura, Japan this past Sunday with Mono Red Aggro, highlighting another strong week for the Red Tide. And let's take a look at where this has evolved. Let's note that there's a green splash, everyone. We have gotten into the world of like, hey, we want Questing Druid, but like not that badly. So there's a light green splash so that you can get the other half of it. But I think it's really about the staying power that we're aiming for with Questing Druid, and the body on it's just kind of a bonus if you keep rolling. 6 green splash lands feels correct if you're just trying to occasionally cast the other side of Questing Druid. I'm not sure that I like the fact that we're not playing a full playset of Copperline Gorge, but, you know, is what it is kind of thing. The piece to me that's weird here is they're playing 1 copy of Hidetsugu's Second Right, and that's wild. That's so wild to me that this was a list that took it all down, and it's playing Hidetsugu's. Like, how often as an aggro player can you get somebody to exactly 10 life, especially in a format with pain lands? I don't know. I can't believe it's actually seeing play, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, I had an exact thought just like that when I saw that as well. We did talk about that card a few episodes ago. But talking about the green splash specifically, I know we see Questing Druid in there. Is there any other green card that makes that splash worth it? Because I mean, honestly, I'm hard pressed to actually splash for green in this deck. I think you want to be very direct with mono red, but I mean, it took down some events. So talk to me about that.
So essentially what they're doing here is they're actually playing the equivalent of Ren's Resolve with a little bonus on the side if you happen to draw the green lands to cast Questing Druid. So I don't even think of it as a green splash. I guess technically it is, but you're not like trying to play Innkeeper's Talent or Snakeskin Veil or any card that requires you to have green lands on turns 1, 2, 3, 4, or even 5, or ever. You can get by just by drawing 2 cards for 1. And maybe that's the point of this, is that you wanted a little more staying power, because this is a list that is pushed Torch the Tower into the main. It's pushed in a lot of hedges for the aggro mirror, but in doing so, it's also given up some of the staying power that you'd normally get. So maybe that's the compromise that has been reached by playing Questing Druid, is you can afford to play 6 to 7 1-drop removal spells now, knowing that Questing Druid's there to bail you out of that card disadvantage that you're going to acquire against other matchups like Golgari Demons.
Yeah, it is an aggro war being waged in the meta right now, so that does make sense. I get it. Okay, talk to us about another deck that has shifted and evolved over the past few weeks, Golgari Demons.
Alrighty, so McWinsaw snagged a trophy from the 79-player MTGO Challenge this past week with Golgari Demons, continuing the deck's evolution, and let's see what shifted here. First of all, Archfiend of the Dross, not a 4 of anymore. We've got a 2 of split with Sheldred, and I think that's because Soulstone Sanctuary's in, and now we're using these as like pseudo copies of Archfiend, so that you have the 8 demon package for Unholy Annex. I like where this is because Shelly is so important right now against the red-based aggro decks for stabilizing, and Archfiend doesn't stabilize as efficiently. Also noting that in the mirror, Archfiend's a hell of a liability against Glissa. Like, you can't do anything. Whereas Shelly in the mirror is fantastic, and it really does a lot for you. Outside of that, Nowhere to Run instead of Anoint with Affliction's an interesting shift. I'm guessing this has to do with an uptick in Sheltered by Ghosts being a different kind of like a bunch of aggro lists are trying to figure out how to perfect Sheltered by Ghosts, and I think this Golgari Demons player was like, okay, we need to be able to get past Ward. That's my guess, at least.
Yeah, that card has put a lot of pressure on mid-range to get it right, and I think that's a potential solution right there. I like that. So speaking of the split between the 2 Soul Stones, the 2 Archfiends, and you were just talking about how you think that's enough. You know, you have the 8 demon package to support Annex. Is this how you would run it though, personally, or are there any other demons that aren't seeing any play? I know we got that new 3-drop, Abyssal Harvester. What do you think about that, really?
I want Abyssal Harvester to not die to Cut Down so badly. I want it to not die to Burst Lightning and Torch the Tower so badly, but the 2-butt on that thing is killing its playability in this format right now. So I think Soulstone's the stronger move right now, and it's more flexible as well. You get to just create a demon on end step many times, which allows you to do that stutter step double spell vibe. That said, the real question here for me is the demon package worth running? And if Arcfiend isn't good, Unholy Annex is carrying most of that weight on its own. Is Unholy Annex in and of itself strong enough to just run it as the demon package with a couple of soul stones? I think that's the question we're going to end up having to answer. I don't know that Arcfiend's going to make the cut in the end because of how much of a liability it can become in many board states. And Desecration Demon, we all tried it. We all tried it. We all wanted it to be good. And you played against one mono white tokens build, and they're just like, whatever, sack the 1/1, make another one anyway. Don't care, never attack with that. And that's all it takes for you to look at it and go, okay, well, this isn't happening. So, especially with Desecration Demon being a thing where they just sacrifice Heartfire Hero and dome you, it's way too risky. Way too risky to play Desecration Demon right now. So the Annex package is going to be a big question that Golgari has to answer, and time will tell, honestly.
Yeah, for Golgari Demons, you've got the other Golgari archetypes vying for attention, and they might get it. This deck might evolve to just, condense into Golgari Ramp. Who knows? But yes, I think that will be the question. Maybe in the next day, the meta will have an answer. Nonetheless, let's continue down the road of Tier 1 and talk about the next deck, Gruul Slickshot.
Yoshioka Hidekiya made it to the finals of Sunday's 49-player Champions Cup qualifier in Namba, Japan this past Sunday with Gruul Slickshot before losing to Dimir in the finals, and let's take a look at why. This is a pretty by-the-numbers list if we're getting down to it. It's only got 13 green sources, which means you're 90% for turn 2, and that makes sense because Snakeskin Veil is not a turn 1 play, and you have no other green turn 1 plays. So 13 sources is plenty. I still don't love Restless Ridgeline in this deck, but so it goes. This is, Max, this is functionally a mono red deck with Questing Druid, Innkeeper's Talent, Snakeskin Veil, and Paw Patch, right? You're running basically the same stuff, but you're shaving off Rockface Villages for a harder splash, and you're shaving off removal spells to push in a little bit more protection. And that really depends on what you're trying to do, right? Like, are you trying to play Slickshot? Are you trying to play the mouse package and ignore everything else? This only plays the 2 Screaming Nemesis. Like, there's so many ways that this gains points and loses points in different matchups just from this shift. And let's note that red-based aggro in the last 2 weeks has made up 30% of the meta in one form or another. And it's not all mono red. This has been successful. This has gotten 12 people into top 8s.
Okay, yeah. We keep asking, whether Gruul is significantly different enough to really be considered its own thing. Is it really just doing what Mono Red does, but maybe slightly more inefficiently? And Gruul keeps popping up in these events and these top 8. So that's the answer to our question right there. But I wanna take a look at those 3 slots in the sideboard. Urbrass Forge. Is there something else that could go there? Urbrass Forge is sort of made, moot by Authority of the Consuls, isn't it? Would we rather have something like Case of the Crimson Pulse in there?
Yeah, and let's clarify that Urbrask's Forge, if they have Authority of the Consuls, isn't just moot, it's a liability. You're giving them a life a turn for free. That is not where you want to be as a mono red player. So I get where you're going with it. I think Urbrask's Forge is well positioned against Dimir, which is a big part of why it hasn't been cut or shaved out of lists. Whereas Case of the Crimson Pulse is probably going to be stronger right now against Mono White because Mono White's running up to 3 copies of Authority of the Consuls, which makes Urbrask's Forge an absolute liability there. The problem is Case of the Crimson Pulse is terrible against Dimir. You play that, they go Fairy Mastermind, great, now you're behind. It's just a liability. So it's one of those things like, how hard do you want to split back and forth? Dimir has been like 20% of the field in the last 2 weeks, and Mono White's not been even 10% necessarily. So I can see where they're just like, nope, we're playing Urbrask's Forge, and we're going to town on Dimir, and we're forcing Mono White to have Authority of the Consuls, or we're going to run them over. I can see where that logic goes, especially in Gruul, where you get Paw Patch formation to blow up those Authority of the Consuls and keep pushing.
Yeah, and this is why we tell folks to pay attention to meta share before you go into these events, right? Because that's a huge flex point right there. Are you seeing more mono white control? Are you seeing more Dimir? And right now it's more Dimir. So yeah, I like that consideration for this choice. Very good. Yeah, Urbrass Forge. Wow. Okay. Tier 1 hasn't changed a whole lot, but let's jump down to Tier 2 and see what decks are there. And we'll begin with mono white control. All right, so Mono White Control by Knipsa 16 this iteration made it to the finals of Saturday's 58-player MTGO challenge with this deck. So let's talk about what's shifted here. We've got 1-1-1 split between the Overlord, Archangel, and Sarah Paragon. Sarah Paragon making a return also sort of justifies the 3 demolition fields that we're seeing in the main board now. We've also got a 3-2 split in the sideboard between Authority, the Consoles, and Elspeth's Smite. So that tells you exactly what's out there right now, and it's aggro. It's aggro winter. We got a couple of copies of Split Up that complement Authority beautifully. That card justifies Split Up. I love the synergy there. We've got 4-4 split here between, where we used to see a 2-4 split between Caretaker's Talent and Enduring Innocence. And that really helps the deck to compete with these other decks that are doing a lot of draw, card advantage, the Beans piles we're still seeing, but mostly Dimir, right? Dimir is all about drawing cards right now, and this sort of helps this deck to keep up. So I like that.
So I look at the mono white list, Max, and I think, do we want the Sunken Citadels as like a 3 of, or do we need to start cutting a few of those to ensure there's enough planes for laydown arms in the main? Because I get that Demolition Field eventually becomes a planes, but like when you're trying to tap out turns 1, 2, and 3 and you don't have enough, that's concerning to me. So where are you on that?
Yeah, I was just going to mention that about the demolition fields becoming a plains, but I still think even with that you probably want to shave off maybe 1 to 2. I would do 2 Sunken Citadels to really ensure that Laydown Arms is doing its work. It's really super effective removal, and we need to be able to remove things like the Overlords, your Archfiends, and now we got to deal with Tolarian Terror as well, Eddie Merc Crab, these very expensive high-end creatures that the other decks are kind of relying on for their engines as well. So giving Laydown Arms more possible targets is significant enough that I say yes. Let's go ahead and shed 1 to 2 copies in favor of just your basic planes.
And I mean, worst case scenario, you're getting rid of tap lands. It's not like you're splashing a second color. So I'm with you on that one. But let's talk about the deck that Mono White doesn't want to see, and that's Temur Combo.
Oh boy. Hodor time, baby. Took down Saturday's 58-player MTGO challenge with those talented but pesky otters. Let's see where this list shifted from the norm. We did talk about this list a few weeks back. We've got new to the list 2 copies of Invasion of Ixalan. And I would say that this card is here to assist the Thunderclap trainer with finding your pieces. It really does help you either to find that, that 3rd color land that you need, or, one of your, Enduring Vitalities, Storm Chaser's Talent, anything of that sort. We've also got 2 copies of Ral Crackling Wit that could possibly come in as well. And, like we said with the Kaidos, I also believe that you want to diversify your threats. Ral is really good at, filling the board with otters and getting to that ultimate much quicker than you think. And that emblem is powerful, a very powerful emblem. It's a game-ending emblem. I also want to point out the rooms here. We've got the 3 Roaring Furnaces / Steaming Saunas, a very good tempo card. The red side, of course, coming in and taking out a creature, doing some damage, controlling the board, and then Steaming Sauna helping you in the late game. This deck really loves to snowball, and it starts off slightly slow. It's got to get its ground, but once you get to like turns 3 or 4, you start dropping your pieces, and I think a card like Steaming Sauna can really help you go over the top of the card advantage. So I can see why that's in there.
So Max, when we talk about Ral, and I agree, it's powerful, especially in a shell like this where you're playing multiple spells a turn, where you are accelerating your mana. What matchup do you want it in particular, though?
I had to think about this because I was trying to justify this card being 2 of in the sideboard, and I was thinking when's the ideal time to bring this in. I think honestly I love the +1 on here. Creating blockers, getting in the way of, we're not seeing Boros Auras here, but that's a deck as well. But the aggro sort of heavy grind matchups where you want to take over the board. He adds to the board state, gets bigger as you cast spells. You're raining fire down your opponents, getting rid of their pieces, and it allows you to eventually attain the emblem rather quickly. And it works really well with Storm Chaser's talent as well. So I think I'm going to say the aggro matchups is really where you want this, but you also kind of want this in the mid range matchups, the low end mid range matchups where they're depending on getting through in the board state. So I don't know. I'm going to say the aggro matchups on this one.
Fair, fair. And with that, let's go to an aggro matchup. Jeskai Convoke.
Manny crushed the 123 player MTGO challenge on December 2nd. Jeskai Convoke, what a statement right there. Resurrecting an archetype that's really long been stagnating in tier 2 land, or worse, not even showing up at all. So let's take a look at this list. I think the first card we have to point out is Sheltered by Ghosts. This card has done phenomenal work in resurrecting sort of the non-red prowess aggro decks and making them, relevant again. And it did so here with Jeskai Convoke. It's really a great piece of removal, great piece, and it's doing work here. It really is, especially against mono red. We've also got 2 Clockwork Percussionists. That equals out to be 10 main board targets for your Gleeful Demolitions. And then I also want to point out the full set of Protect the Negotiators in the sideboard. I think this is a great counter spell, a great protection spell that not a lot of people are playing. We might have even forgot it existed. But I think overall this deck has a simple, elegant design, an immaculate curve out. The sideboard plan is kind of obvious with what it wants to do. I think the deck is close to being solved, being optimized. Yeah. What would you say?
So I look at this, and the only card that I have this giant question mark next to, Max, is Clockwork Percussionist. And can we find something a little bit stronger is really where I'm at.
That's possible. That's possible. One card that I've toyed with my Convoke builds is honestly Annabella. I know it's 1 more mana value, but it can be a win con, especially in a deck where you do get Gleeful Demolition off, and it's an artifact. So, if you don't draw your turn 1 artifact creator, you can nuke the Annabella if you like. But this is a card that can create the wide board state that way, and it also gives you a huge payoff for having a wide board state. So, say your opponent gummies up the board, you're not able to attack with your wide board state of creatures, your slate of creatures, attack anyway, and this does damage, gains you life, regardless of what the outcome of the battle is. So sometimes you can win with an Annabella.
Well, and I like the fact that you're gaining life from it, right? So this is potentially helping that aggro mirror where you need to do things like play Sheltered by Ghosts and gain life and get tempo back, and you're able to go wide and just utilize that. So that's an interesting idea. I gotta test that out, to be honest with you. I've not messed with it, and I've wanted to for a very long time, so I'm
Yeah.
in. But in the meantime, let's talk a little bit about Simic Spells.
Terror is back. Simic Spells, aka Simic Terror. Ian Mark Gutierrez won a 28-player RCQ in the Philippines over the weekend with Simic Spells, continuing the archetype's climb from obscurity, really. So let's take a look at the list. I just want to summarize that the deck's goal is to win with the big creature, right? Make Tolarian Terror an early game card, by milling yourself, by casting spells, tempo the opponent while doing so, and then you hit them with the Eddie Merc Crab to sort of limit the opposition, hit them with the Terror. And it's a really simple game plan, but it works. I think one card that's sort of enabled this deck to be a thing is the 4 copies that we see in here of Unsummon. I've talked about this card before. Unsummon is phenomenal for tempoing aggro, tempoing mid-range. We've got a full set of Cache Grab that's going to be your fundamental way to grab things out of your graveyard. And 4 copies, this also gets cheaper based on how many spells you've cast, but this town ain't big enough to really replay your Storm Chaser's talents, to really replay your Beanstalks if you need to, or to just tempo the opponent and get in for the win. So I think this card has multiple uses, and it sort of functions as the core of the deck.
Fair. Now, the big question for me, Max, is how does this deck function if your opponent plays a turn 1 Ghost Vacuum? Because that terrifies me.
Yeah, that's a really good question. You don't have the color set to really deal with it, even from the sideboard. So, from Simic standpoint, I can see how that card would seem like kind of like a weak point for this deck on the surface. I think though, because of the fact that it has to pick the 1 card, it's very slow at getting rid of your graveyard. So long as you can pilot around it, if you're quick enough with the game plan, milling enough cards per turn to overwhelm it, You can still win big early. It just becomes a sort of a 50-50 question, in my opinion. But the possibility of having your 8 creatures taken is still something to play around. I would say to anybody piloting Simic Terror, definitely, even more than the Reanimator decks, pilot carefully. Plan for the Ghost Vacuums at least game 2, game 3, right?
Fair, and it's not like you don't have bounce spells to reset them. It's more a question of can you get out the big fatties if they're pulling all the instants out of your graveyard. And my guess is it's a bit of an uphill battle, but like how many Ghost Vacuums do you really expect? You know what I mean? Where are we at?
Yeah.
There's not a ton of reanimation in the format, right? But
Right.
with that, we're going to move it along. Favorite segment every week, Brewer's Corner. I'm going to go ahead and kick things off. Let's talk about Azorius Cookies. So, credit to Doomwake. They already have a whole video out about this, and they did quite well in a recent tournament with it. But this is yet again another aggro variant with Sheltered by Ghosts. And I want to impress the importance of that upon everybody, because I think Sheltered by Ghosts is the dividing line between Red Aggro that has been taking over and slightly slower aggro and or swarm strategies that are combating the Red Aggro without trying to give up too many points to mid-range. And that's really where they've gone, is said, okay, Sheltered by Ghosts really helps deal with that Heartfire hero issue and that aggro mirror. You know, like you take out their biggest threat and you smack them in the teeth and gain life. Like it does all of the things you want quickly. What I like about this list is that Leyline Axe has a home. Love that. This list also gets under most of the aggro decks. Like it is faster than most of the aggro decks. It also gets chunkier than most of the aggro decks. And you have a ton of life gain between Steel Seraph and Sheltered by Ghosts. Not to mention bunnies, when you have Mockingbird, feels really, really good. You know, you make a bunny, you make a couple more bunnies, you play a Steel Seraph, you smack him in the teeth for 10 and gain 10. It is really fun when that thing gets out of hand.
Yeah, very fun, aggressive deck. I like this as an alternative to the red-based stuff that we're seeing in aggro. Very fun. I'm going to talk about Dimir Cauldron, another fun list. Credit to the MTG Rebellion Discord helping put this together. Finally, a Prof list that I can actually get behind proudly and not say that's just a pet card of mine, because I was trying Prof decks last set to no avail. But this is, you got Cauldron, you got Prof, and you have Arcanus, and this is what's been introduced to this archetype. Arcanus allowing you to tap and draw 3 cards. I mean, that's something you want in your graveyard relatively quickly. That's definitely an ability you want to copy and put on one of your creatures, especially since this deck has so many evasive early game creatures. Don't forget also, we're seeing a card come back, Rona, and this is an old school standard card. But Rona does flip to become a very mean creature on the backside, but on the front side, of course, helps you to discard, get things into your graveyard. You've also got other ways to discard, including Kiora, which is new. That 8/8 does come out pretty often with this deck, so beware of that if you're playing against it. And then, of course, we also have Steam Core Scholar, which helps dump 2 cards as soon as it gets in there. Works really well, synergizes really well with Prof. So I'm in love with this deck so far. I also want to note that Cauldron is just like a natural shutdown for Reanimator lists as well. So yeah, multiple uses there. I like where this deck is placed. Maybe we'll see it in the tier 2 or tier 1 in subsequent weeks.
I mean, there's something to be said when your main combo shuts out other combo decks. So nicely done, Soul Cauldron. Love seeing that. I honestly, Max, I just want to see a creature with an activated ability that fits naturally into that deck that happens to be amazing against aggro. You know, like give me a Valgavoth on a Cauldron kind of vibe. And you know what I mean? That's what I'm looking for. I love the rest of this list, but I am terrified to play that against mono red aggro right now. So we'll see. We've got a lot of room to mess with that, but we're going to move it right along.
I was about to say that.
Yeah. We're going to move it right along and talk about Sakdos. All right, credit to the Arena Ladder. You got me. I spent like a day and a half trying to break this deck. I haven't managed to do it, but I spent a long time trying to tune it up. Some things I learned. Alicia, Who Laughs at Fate, much stronger than I thought it was going to be. There are so many scenarios where this card comes out main phase 2 and your opponents just go, fuck. And it's just a constant scenario because You're going to swing. They're going to want to kill the creature to prevent the damage, but most of them wait until after you've already swung to see which creatures you're swinging with, which triggers raid. At which point, you're going to get whatever they killed back, and that is a huge problem for them. The other pieces I like about this is basically pre-boarded against mono red. You have Torch the Towers, you have Nowhere to Runs, and you have Final Vengeance, which is exile-based removal at 1 mana in a deck that has plenty of ways to turn it on. So I really like where this went. I will say, for reference, I did try to shift this into like a red-black Heartfire Hero deck just so I could use Spiteful Hexmage on Heartfire Hero to trigger Valiant, because it doesn't actually change the creature to have that cursed roll on it at all. It just triggers Valiant, which is lovely. It's not as good as mono red, but we tried. We had to try. You know what I mean? Like, is what it is.
You gotta try Rakdos at least once.
Right.
But let's move along and talk about another aggro list, this time in Selesnya colors. Let's go. Yet another aggro variant with Sheltered by Ghost. That is going to be the card of the day for sure. We've been talking about this card so often today. So I won't mention it again, but I will mention Toby is seeing play here. You combine that with Virtue of Loyalty, the Overlord of the Mistmoors, Enduring Innocence. You've got a mini white control token strategy within this deck. And I love that. I love when you can say that. We've also got a card that doesn't see a whole lot of play. I just want to point out Collector's Cage. It's one of those hideaway cards, but it's got a very cool mechanic on it that actually makes it more useful than the hideaway cards we used to see in Standard. Collector's Cage, allowing you to add the 1/1 counters. Once you get to a point where you have different powers, it takes off, and you get to cast something big. Maybe you get to cast one of your Overlords. Maybe you get to cast Virtue of Loyalty. So I love what this deck is trying to do, how it's trying to synergize and just sort of be very aggressive. Selesnya, you're used to seeing very small, like weenie creatures with 1/1 counters. This deck isn't trying to do that. It's really trying to ground and pound. So props to Miss Lizzie, who got a top 4 in MTGO challenge on November the 30th.
And it's worth noting too, Max, that Selesnya deck can do turn 3 Overlord of the Mistmoors as a 6/6. Like, it's weird, but it can pull it off with Collector's Cage if you get lucky. And I got to do that in one game, and it felt so good. So good.
That's so gross.
Right. Turn
So
3 Overlord
gross.
on the play, just a 6/6 with 2 like lingering souls. Oh god, it was great. Anyway, that's going to bring us to our final segment, Ahead of the Curve. Now, Max, once more, we looked at 12 archetypes in our recap. What are you playing going into week 4 of Foundation Standard?
So I've been taking a look at the mono-colored strategies, especially since we did our interview with Vixen Severe and we talked about mono-colored deck building. I decided to go ahead and play mono black skeletons. So the big card here is Corpse of the Lost. Corpse of the Lost, trying to make that work. So of course you got a full play set in here. The haste, the power boost that you give to skeletons, pretty awesome. Even beyond turn 3, you're doing a lot of damage. So I want to point out that we've got 10 1-drop skeletons in this deck. We've got 4 copies of Case of the Sash Skeleton, turn 2. And then turn 3, we've got 3 copies of Gix. So we're just trying to do that old school turn 1 creature, turn 2 creature, turn 3, draw some cards. We've got 1 copy of the Death Baron. Not super high on this card. We used to have 3 copies, but I felt like that 3-drop slot needed something else, so we went with Gix instead. The Death Baron, Gisa, and the new Liliana, the new old Liliana, in the 6-drop slot gives you some really cool zombie synergy as well, especially since you're creating 2/2 zombies with that Liliana. And 3 mainboard Duresses plus all this early removal that's in the deck allows you to really commit crimes, have Gisa flood the board, and take over by that turn. So I also notably have the Shellys in there. I think Shelly is definitely a card that stock value is coming back. It's coming back up, especially because we're seeing so much Dimir, right? So much draw advantage. So Shelly, 1 in the main, 1 in the sideboard. I'm kind of playing with that.
Yeah, and I mean, Shelly makes a lot of sense when you consider 30% red-based aggro, like 20% Dimir. That's half the format that doesn't want to see Shelly land. So I get why that's a thing at this point. That said, the deck I'm going to feature here, Jeskai Convoke. All right, same list you saw earlier. I just want to go slightly more in depth with it. To me, I've been playing a few matches with this on the ladder, messing around with it in some testing. This is the best Sheltered by Ghost deck I've seen. And I've tried like 8 different builds, 8 different ideas, everything from Azorius Enchantress to Boros Auras, on over to Selesnya Aggro, back to this. This, to me, is a great, great call right now. Everybody is so terrified of those mono red aggro lists and Gruul prowess that they are playing a ton of single target removal. And this deck doesn't give a shit. It doesn't care. You can kill a lot of creatures. It's going to reload. It's going to 2-for-1 you left and right on that because it has Resolute Reinforcements and Knight Errant of Eos. So they're just going to keep coming at you. And that makes it incredibly difficult to deal with because they have to have wrath effects. Like I played a couple games on the, or a couple matches on the ladder. The only loss I had was Golgari Ramp because it had 8 wrath effects and it could actually contain me with Harvesters of Misery, Gix's Commands, and Deadly Cover-Ups. But it needed 2 wraths every single game to keep this contained. And not a lot of people are doing it. So that's why I think this list took down that 123 player tournament, because everybody was gunning with single target removal, and this list just didn't care. And really briefly, I just want you guys to understand, the meta looks like this right now. If 30% is mono red, or red-based aggro, Gruul prowess, all that, 20% is Dimir, 13% is Golgari Demons, 8% is mono white, 7% is Zero's Domain, 5% is Otters, and 17% is everything else. You can see where this becomes a good option because there just aren't that many decks that are equipped and ready to dedicate wrath slots in the sideboard for a deck that's less than 5% of the meta. And it's the only swarm strategy that's realistically doing well right now. So that's why I like where this is positioned.
I've always said, and this is why I've loved Convoke so much over the past year, is when you're not seeing heavy board wipe meta, which we're not right now, this deck does really well. When I'm playing this deck and I see single target removal come out of the opponent's hand, turn 1, turn 2, I smile because I'm like, whoa, you're not prepared. So yeah, this deck is definitely catching people off guard. But that's another week in the books. Thank you all for supporting us, and I want to give a special shout out to our members who support the Rebellion by watching these videos all the way through. Thank you so much. It truly helps. And I'd also like to give a special extra shout out to Vixen Zavir for being our most recent special guest on the podcast. I had a lot of fun talking about deck building with him. And I can't wait to reveal the next one from the Rebellion community. So we'll be back next week with more analysis.
Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment on this video. Every single click you give us helps, and we appreciate it massively. So until next time, Rebels, untap, upkeep, resist.